Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this meeting with our guest today, Dr. Daniel Pipes, who has visited last year and received the Free Press Award 2007. I'll say more about him later, but about the program today, we'll start out with a speech by Daniel Pipes. Then there'll be a brief intermission. After that, you can ask some questions. And at the end, there'll be an award ceremony where Helen Bikes will receive the Raoul Wallenberg Medal for this year. More about that later. Daniel Pipes needs not much of an introduction. There's so much to say about him, and I can hardly remember all of his accomplishments here. Dr. Pipes is the director of the Middle East Forum. He's also, as I understand it, a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution in the US. He's a regular contributor to many important newspapers and magazines all over the world, such as the Jerusalem Post, Die Welt in Germany, and many others. He's also the author of quite a number of books dealing with the Middle East and Islam, the most important of which, from our perspective, of course, is the Rushdie affair, the novel The Ayatollah and the West, and also a book called Militant Islam Reaches America. So quite an accomplished researcher, quite an accomplished speaker, and participant in public discussions. So please, Dr. Pipes.
Thank you so much, Lars, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a delight to be back here with the Danish Free Press Society. As Lars mentioned, I was here just 15 months ago. At that time, I came especially to Copenhagen for the award. This time I'm here for another reason. I'm actually part of a birthday present. My mother is giving my father a cruise for his 85th birthday, and she brought the family. And so here I am, on my way to the cruise, leaving this evening. I last time spoke about radical Islam. Today I'm talking about the Arab-Israeli conflict. And the next time I hope to speak to you about Islam in Europe, which I think is a topic of direct interest to yourselves. We can refer to it glancingly today, but I think it is worth a separate discussion. I would like to present to you ideas about the Arab-Israeli conflict, which I expect are not common in your general discussion. I'll approach it as a historian. I'll approach it as someone who spent close to 40 years studying the Middle East. Try and give you what I hope will be a deeper picture of a complex and changing phenomenon. Let me start by noting that Israel just celebrated its 60th anniversary. And it has much to boast of in these 60 years. It is a stable, open, political culture, a dynamic economy, a cutting-edge high-tech sector, a lively culture, and an impressive social cohesion. But for all of its achievements, Israel at 60 lives under a curse. The curse is the curse of the threat of extinction. Its remarkable progress has not liberated it from a multi-pronged set of challenges that include nearly every aspect that one can think of. Let me mention several. The first threat to Israel is weapons of mass destruction, most famously coming from Iran, but also from Syria. Second, there's conventional arms, tanks, planes, ships, most especially from Egypt, but also from other countries. Then there's terrorism, coming from Hezbollah, from Fatah, from Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and others. Then there's economic blockade, the boycott that still goes on 60 years later, isolating Israel from its neighbors. There's demographic assault, that is to say, the attempt to make non-Jews into Israelis. The right of return, what the Palestinians call the right of return, is a way of eliminating Israel, by overwhelming it demographically. And finally, there's ideological undermining, the constant challenge to Zionism, to Jewish nationalism, saying that this is an evil, it's a form of racism, and so forth. So on every level, weapons of mass destruction, conventional war, terrorism, economics, demographics, ideology, Israel's under assault. And I would argue that there's no country in the world today that faces such a wide range of threats. Indeed, I go further, and speaking as a historian, argue that there's no country ever that has faced such a range of assaults. In particular, what one hears are the calls for Israel's elimination. I'm not using the word destruction, because it's not necessarily destruction, not necessarily destroying Tel Aviv, but eliminating the Jewish, eliminating the Zionist entity, eliminating the country that exists on the basis of expressing the desire of Jews to have a sovereign country. For example, Ehud Ya'ari, a major voice in the Israeli political debate, notes that more than 30 years after the Arab states and their army commanders came to the conclusion that they had no viable means to remove Israel from the map, the discourse in the Arab world is changing, with spontaneous hurrahs about the Zionist clock ticking towards its final hour. Now this attack or assault need not be military. It could be demographic, it could be economic, it could be ideological. And that's why I use the word eliminate rather than destroy. One finds that these calls to eliminate Israel take two forms, what I like to call the polite and the crude. The crude calls come from, example, Iran. The president of Iran, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, has said, quote, "The regime occupying Jerusalem must be eliminated from the pages of history." This is unprecedented. Heads of state do not speak like this about other countries, and yet it's now taking place on a regular basis, coming from Iran. Another example of a crude threat would be coming from Hamas or Hezbollah. Here's the head of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah. Can Israel be eliminated, he asked. Yes, and 1,000 yeses, Israel can be eliminated. There's a second type of threat to Israel, or call for Israel's elimination, that is more polite, that is more indirect. For example, Yasser Arafat, when he was alive, used to call for, quote, "a jihad to liberate Jerusalem," unquote. Well, that's not exactly the same as eliminating Israel. When you think about it, it actually means the same thing. Or the right of return that Palestinians claim. What does right of return mean? It means that millions of Palestinians will enter Israel, thereby changing the very nature of the state and ending its Zionist character. The one-state solution, i.e., no more Israel, no more Zionist entity. Cartographic. You see maps, including at the United Nations, that show the Eastern Mediterranean without an Israel, show Palestine. In fact, in Arabic, you'll almost never see, coming out of the Middle East, maps that show Israel. They won't even show Tel Aviv. They'll show Jaffa, they'll show Haifa, they'll show Jerusalem. They pretend as though Israel isn't there. Or, for example, Israeli Arabs are calling for a state of its citizens. In other words, no special rights, no special nature of the regime being Jewish. It should be no Star of David in the flag, no mention of the Jewish spirit in the national anthem, no special emphasis on Hebrew, or the Sabbath, or the law of return. All these things should be eliminated, and Israel should be a state of its citizens. Or historical, the commemoration of the Nakba, so-called Nakba, the catastrophe of 1948. In all these ways, Arabs and others are calling for the elimination of Israel. Nakba, right of return, no presence in the maps, jihad for Jerusalem, one-state solution. All of these say no more Israel. And these kind of statements don't just come from the Middle East, they can also be heard in the West. Here, for example, is a journalist writing a few years ago in The Guardian in Britain. Israel, as it is constitutionally and legally configured, he said, has no moral right to exist, and a single-state solution is the only way of achieving a practical justice, i.e., no more Israel. Here's a columnist in the Washington Post. Israel itself is a mistake. And so forth and so on. There are many voices in the arts and politics who are calling for Israel to be eliminated. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, what I'm trying to establish is that the issue here is the very existence of Israel. Should there be a Jewish state or not? And what's so striking is that this is a recent development. Think back 15 years to 1993, to the Oslo Accords. And there was a general assessment, agreement, understanding that this threat had come to an end. That between 1948 and 1993, Palestinians, Arabs, Gamal Abdel Nasser, and others had worked to eliminate Israel. And then in 1993, on the lawn of the White House, on a late summer day, Yasser Arafat shook the hand of Yitzhak Rabin and said, "It's over. We accept that you're here." And this was seen as a great transformation, a great victory for diplomacy, and a great advance in the Arab-Israeli conflict. In fact, looking back 15 years later, one can see that that was not, in fact, the case. That it was a deception. It was unreal. And that the drive by the Palestinians, Arabs, and Muslims to eliminate Israel is still there. In fact, it's even more strongly there than before. The optimism of Oslo of 1993 is gone. An issue that seemed settled 15 years ago is back. Now, why, after not hearing such voices for some years, have they come back with such intensity? What do these new dangers mean for Israel and for others? What policies should be adopted to address these circumstances? The causes of the crisis are multiple. For example, there is the rise of radical Islam, which was already strong in 1993, but is even stronger today. This is a global phenomenon that is deeply anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist, and that has turned neighbors against Israel. Related to that is the second wind in Iran. The revolution had seemed weak, had seemed to be no longer a force. And now, with the coming to power of veterans of the Iraq-Iran war, the revolution has new strength. Hard, determined, and extremist individuals are now in power in Tehran. One reason, then, is radical Islam. A second is that the left has turned against Israel. One finds this in Europe, one finds it in North America, one finds it around the world. It's a global phenomenon. The hard left sees Israel as the symbol of all that's wrong. Such figures as Edward Said, Noam Chomsky, Ken Livingston, George Galloway are indicative of this trend. This is a historic shift because in past decades, the left had generally been favorable. The Soviet Union was the second country to recognize Israel after the United States. Now, there's not much that I, as an American foreign policy analyst, can do about the rise of radical Islam and the hard left turning against Israel. But a third reason for this situation is mistakes made by Israel itself and by Western governments. And that's my focus here. I think that Israel is now paying for past mistakes. What I'd like to do is focus on these mistakes. And there are two in particular that stand out. One is a change of policy, and the other is a wrong understanding of the war that's underway. Change of policy. Between 1948 and 1993, Israel had pursued a policy in which victory was the goal. In other words, the Israelis pursued a policy of trying to force their enemies to give up. They did this by establishing a policy of toughness, intimidating their enemies. Don't you dare do this, or you will pay a price. Ariel Sharon, for example, came to prominence in the 1950s responding to what were then called fedayeen attacks, terrorist attacks. If they came from Egypt, he attacked Egyptian villages. If they came from Jordan, he did the same in Jordan. If he came from Syria, he did the same in Syria. And it pretty soon became clear to the Egyptian, Jordanian, and Syrian governments this was not a good idea, and they stopped doing it. That policy is summed up in the word deterrence. Don't do anything to me, or you'll pay a price. The goal of deterrence is to get the enemy to give up. In a different format, deterrence was at the heart of the Cold War. We in the West deterred the Soviet Union until finally, in 1991, the Soviet Union gave up, collapsed. We didn't win it. They lost it. We imposed our will on them. They gave up. What Israel tried to do between 1948 and 1993 was establish that same kind of reputation. Don't try. It'll hurt you more than it hurts us. You can't make this happen. Any violence you use will be counterproductive. Give up. In 1993, the Israelis made a profound shift. Because deterrence, although it is a successful policy, is also a slow one that can take decades. It hadn't worked in 45 years. It was working, but it had not succeeded. It's boring. It's passive. You can't make it happen. You have to wait for your enemy to give up. It's expensive. It's frustrating. Nothing seems to happen. Year after year, decade after decade. And so finally in 1993, the Israelis decided to try a different kind of approach. More active. In which resolution replaces victory. No longer is the goal to impose the will of Israel on its neighbors. Now the goal is to have resolution, to have an agreement, to have a compromise. Everyone comes away satisfied. No victor, no loser. Everyone is satisfied. This entails an effort to convince the enemy to leave one alone, to make concessions that are clever and timely, to have a peace process, to be active, to be coming up with ideas about Jerusalem, about borders, about armaments, about natural resources, about where people might live. This policy also has a name. Anybody have an idea of what this policy is called? The policy of making timely concessions to an enemy? Appeasement. Thank you. Appeasement. Now, appeasement has a dirty name, but appeasement worked for the British in the 19th century. Appeasement was what the British did, say, in Africa and India, when they had a tribal chief or a Raja who was discontent. They gave him some money, they gave him some land, they gave him some arms. He was content. It worked. It didn't work with Hitler. It didn't work with Brezhnev in the 1970s, and it didn't work with Arafat in the 1990s. It doesn't work with an ideological enemy. You give the ideological enemy something, and he will say, give me more. It doesn't work. But in short, the Israelis got bored of deterrence and decided on appeasement. Much more exciting. But appeasement did not work. And by the year 2000, that became clear to the Israelis. And the symbol I like to use for this is that in 1993, on the White House lawn, Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat shook hands. And those of you who were watching these events back then may remember there were photographs of these two hands shaking. They were all the time. It was a symbol, it was an icon of what diplomacy can achieve. These two enemies shook hands, and the problem had been solved. Well, in 2000, 7 years later, almost to the day, there were another two hands that became the symbol. Two Israeli reservists in the army took a wrong turn and ended up in Ramallah, and they were murdered. They were murdered by a young man who strangled them. And then he went to the window and showed his hands, bloody red hands, to the international media. So it went from this to that, from peacemaking to murder. That's what appeasement achieved for Israel. Rather than winning Palestinian sympathy, goodwill, appeasement caused Palestinians to feel ambitious, angry, enraged. They wanted more. Exactly the wrong thing. And so by 2000, the Israelis gave up on appeasement and then tried something else. In May of that year, the Israeli Prime Minister withdrew from Lebanon, just suddenly, overnight. And then in 2005, the Israeli Prime Minister withdrew from Gaza, a little more slowly. And now the discussion is about withdrawing unilaterally from the West Bank. This isn't working either, because in 2006 there was a war that Israel had, and it was being attacked from Gaza and Lebanon. So clearly, pulling troops out of these two places was not a success. As a result, one finds an Israel today that is not using deterrence, is not appeasing, is not unilaterally withdrawing, and one can't find any particular way to describe it. There is news these very days of a kind of accord with Hamas, of negotiations with Syria, of possible negotiations with or understanding with Hezbollah. It's a country without a policy. Seems to me what the Israelis should do is go back to deterrence. Granted, it didn't work in those 45 years, but it was working. Israel was in a much better situation in 1993 than it had been in 1948. So the first mistake was change of policy from deterrence to appeasement to unilateral withdrawal to nothing. The second is a wrong understanding of war. Yitzhak Rabin used to say, you don't make peace with your friends, you make peace with your enemies. Think about it. You can't make peace with your enemies. Enemies are enemies. They want to harm you. What he should have said, it's a big difference. You don't make peace with your friends, you make peace with your former enemies. People who are no longer your enemies. People who have changed. Now, there's a war underway in which the Israeli goal is to win the acceptance of its enemies, that they leave it alone, accept its existence, and the war ends. The Palestinian, Arab, and Muslim goal is to eliminate Israel. These two goals are binary. It's either or. Black and white, 0 and 1. You can't have both. Either Israel's accepted or Israel's eliminated. There's no compromise. No compromise. This war has been underway in this fashion since 1948, but in some sense even earlier, before Israel came into existence as a state. My logic is that the war is underway, and that one side, the war will end when one side gives up. It can be Israel, it can be the Palestinians. If the Israelis give up, there is no more Israel. There's a one state, I don't know what there is. Israelis leave, Israelis are killed, Israelis submit to Palestinian rule. Don't know what the outcome will be, but there's no Israel. There's no Jewish state. That's one solution. Then there'll be no more war. Reach a peace. No more war. Or Israel wins, and its enemies accept it and no longer make war on it. That's peace. Those are the two stable conditions. I do not believe that compromise is possible. Had it been possible, it would have taken place. Oslo Accords would have achieved it. They didn't. In fact, they did more harm than good. So I believe that each of us has a choice looking at this war. You can be for the Palestinians and want no more Israel, or you can be for Israel and want the Palestinians to accept it. And the rest is details, where exactly the borders are and what the resource division is, and Jerusalem, how it's divided. These are all details. Once the basic principles accepted, Israel's there, as a Jewish state and accepted, or it's not, then there's peace, and you work out the consequences. War will go on so long as both sides have the will to keep it going. It'll end when one side no longer has the will. And ladies and gentlemen, I have lived through defeat. I'm an American, and I lived through the defeat of Vietnam. We, the United States, were much stronger than the Vietnamese government in Hanoi. Every way, many more people, much greater GNP, much larger arsenal, but we lost because they had the greater will to continue, and we lost our will. We gave up. We gave up our goal of an independent South Vietnam. And the way you can see that we truly lost is that no one has ever, since 1975, seriously raised the idea of going back and trying again. It's over. Finished. We lost. So I've seen it firsthand, how it happens. It's not a pleasant experience. But it ends it. There's no more war. It's over. One way or another, it ends when one side gives up. Defeat and victory are required here. And historically, if you look back, not just at Vietnam, but at other wars, you see that attempts at resolution don't work. Famously, the Paris Peace Conference in the early 1970s did not work. Oh, the people there got a Nobel Prize, but it didn't work. Any more than Sadat and, than Arafat and Perez and Rabin got a Nobel Peace Prize. It didn't help. So what happens? For example, 1918, the Germans were defeated, but they didn't feel defeated. They didn't give up. They looked at their cities and their armies, and they were standing and they were strong, and they came up with a conspiracy theory that their leadership had betrayed them. And I said, we want to try this again. And we did. And the Allies made sure in 1945 that the Germans understood they lost. They made very sure that this same misunderstanding wouldn't take place a second time. And the second time the Germans understood and gave up. That goal of dominating Europe ended in 1945. It's never been resurrected. Over. That was victory. 1918 was not victory. 1945 was victory. One can see the many, many wars. For example, in Korea, the North lost in 1953, but it didn't lose so badly that it gave up. 55 years later, the possibility that tomorrow morning they will attack. It's still there. The Iraq-Iran war ended in 1988, but neither side really gave up. It was only when Saddam Hussein was thrown out of power in 2003 that it truly ended. Wars end when one side gives up. In this case, we have to choose. I, and I hope you, believe that Israel should win. It's, as I said at the beginning, a vibrant, democratic, modern society, and destroying it is a bad idea. So the goal, my goal, and the goal of all Western governments, is to help Israel. And my goal is to say not just help it, but to help it win. That means that Israel should not just have the freedom and legitimacy to defend itself. That's not enough. It has to win. It has to impose its will on its enemy. It has to impose its will on Palestinians, Arabs, Muslims, that they accept Israel's existence. They accept the results of 1948. They accept that their historic goals of eliminating Israel are dead, over, defunct, finished. This implies a Palestinian change of heart, a profound change I'm speaking specifically of Palestinians, but it also applies to the many Arabic speakers and many Muslims who agree that Israel should be eliminated. They must undergo a change of heart. In other words, the change isn't on Israel's side. The change is on the Palestinian side. This implies a huge shift in approach to the problem. It's not saying to the Israelis, hey, give them some more. It's saying, let's figure out with Israel what it can do to win so that the war ends the right way. As a result of this approach, I have a very simple prism for how I understand events in the Arab-Israeli theater. Anything that compels the Palestinians to understand that they're losing is a good thing. Anything that encourages the Palestinians to think that they can win is a bad thing. How can one tell that the Palestinians have lost? Well, there are many ways, but one would be for there to be no more violence. For maps in Arabic to show Israel, Tel Aviv. These would be signs that the war is over. And at that point, it would make sense to have negotiations over territory, Jerusalem, armaments, resources, residency, and so forth. At that point, negotiations can fruitfully begin. So, how to deal with the Palestinians? There are two opposite views. The prevailing viewpoint, enunciated by all governments, including the Israeli, is that the Palestinians accepted Israel in 1993, but they have grievances, they're unhappy. Occupation, poverty, and humiliation. This is what you'll hear everywhere. And those grievances have led to suicide bombing and other unhappy results. Mine is the opposite. It's not a matter of, first of all, the Palestinians did not accept Israel in 1993. And they do not feel oppressed, suicidal, miserable. They feel rather strong, optimistic, exhilarated, hopeful that they can attain their goals. In other words, the will to become a suicide bomber comes not from oppression. It comes from a sense of ambition, that you can make a difference, that you giving up your life is part of a military, political, psychological effort to cause the Israelis to give up. You're one bullet in this war, and it makes a difference. It's worth doing. If you don't think it's worth doing, why would you give up your life? The policy implications of this are quite profound. I would say that the consensus view today is that Israel needs to make concessions. And I'm saying the Palestinians must be pushed to accept Israel. The consensus view has Israel giving things, land, territory, money, land, money, arms. My view is that Israel must win. The consensus view would like to please the Palestinians. A Paris donors conference in December got pledges of $7.3 billion over 3 years, I believe, for the Palestinians. It's an incredible amount of money for not many people. Much more money than anybody else in the world gets. I don't want to give them money. I want to crush their will. I want them to realize that the world disapproves of what they're doing. I want for there no more aid, no more arms, no more recognition, no more discussion of final status, no more discussions of the Palestinian state, no more pieces of paper being signed, no more Israeli concessions. Rather, Israel and Western states should develop policies with the goal of getting the Palestinians to give up. This might mean recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. It might mean dealing with the Palestinian so-called refugee problem, discouraging anti-Zionist incitement, encouraging Israeli deterrence, and maintaining Israel's military edge. I don't want to go into details of what those steps might be, because my goal is not to figure out in detail what our policy should be. Just to say, here's a different approach. It's an approach that's not supported by any government. But the existing approach is failing and failing and failing and failing. What has, as I tried to show you earlier, things are much worse now than they were in 1993. Continuing down the same road of roadmap, and trying to bring Mahmoud Abbas to the bargaining table with the Israelis, and isolating Hamas. All this has not worked. It's not going to work. Absolutely predict it's not going to work. It's a fool's errand. In conclusion, the situation at present is a tragic one because everyone loses. Israel, a dynamic, modern Western state, is forced, unlike any other Western state, to assert its existence through force on a daily basis. It is harmed by this. It's doing well, but it's harmed. Ironically, the Palestinians are much more harmed by this situation. The Palestinians are living under dictatorship, extremism, they're poor, backward, because they're determined to eliminate their neighbor. Were they to give that up, were they to focus on their own lives and forget Israel, they are a skilled and dignified people who could achieve great things. They could develop a polity, a culture, a society, an economy. None of that will happen so long as everything is focused on killing their neighbors. Only when the Palestinians are defeated, when their will is crushed, can they begin to build. It's a little analogous to Germany. Only after finally the Germans were shown that no, you can't dominate Europe, did you have a modern, constructive Germany. But it took a lot of pain to achieve that. It will not be painless in this case either. But once that happy day comes, that the Palestinians accept Israel's there and is permanent, then they can start to build. So our goal should be that the Arabs first accept Israel, and then the Arab-Israeli conflict can end, and the former combatants are liberated. And that will be good for both sides. It's not just a pro-Israel, it's both pro-Israel and pro-Palestinian. This is, however, a policy that's not exactly popular. As I started at the beginning by saying, these are ideas you don't hear here. But I think it's time for fresh ideas. Fresh ideas that acknowledge that there's a war underway, and that wars end when one side gives up, not through clever schemes. Challenge you to come up with wars that have ended because of clever ideas. They end rather when one side gives up.